Super. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. My name is Jim Weikert with Power System Engineering, and we're glad to have you join us. The webinar we're talking about today, broadband considerations and opportunities. Certainly there are a lot of increases in the interest in broadband, especially with everyone working and schooling from home and advances in technology. So the webinar today will kind of go through those considerations. Just talking a little bit about logistics. So we have a question and answer, and you can submit a question anytime using the Q&A feature. So you should see a screen as highlighted in the red circle there, an icon you can click on to submit a question. So please feel free to submit those questions, and I will be monitoring those. Those will come just to me, and then I will interject and I'll pose those questions to Tom Asp, who is our presenter, and we'll do our best to answer those well for you. If the questions are deep, if they require an extended conversation, we're happy to follow up afterwards as well and have those conversations. So we'll try to, as well as answering the questions well, we'll also try to answer or honor your time that you have here. So in addition to that, if you would like, you can put on subtitles and closed captioning in order to see things, and putting the presentation into full screen mode, as you can see with the two vertical arrows, or the vertical arrow might help it so that you can see things better. So then just a bit of an introduction. Maybe a good number of you are familiar with Power System Engineering, but my name is Jim Weikert. I'm the Vice President of Utility Automations and Communications. PSE has been around for over 45 years. We have offices across 7 states in the Midwest, and we offer a wide range of services, engineering both for utility and industrial customers, rates and finance, renewable energy, automation, and communications. And so today we're focusing on communications and broadband, and in working with clients, we've worked with municipalities, electric cooperatives, telephone cooperatives, a lot of different types of entities, as well as industrial customers, with over 500 clients in the past 5 years. And as you can see from the diagram, they're kind of spread all across the United States. So again, trying to just bring some of what we have seen. So hopefully that complements and provides you a bit of information about questions that might be coming up for you. With that, then I'll hand it over to Tom and let him begin. Thanks for your time.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Yeah, this is Tom Asp with Power System Engineering. Yeah, and I've been kind of involved in the broadband industry now since the late 90s, and so we've seen quite a progression from the days when municipalities first started looking at getting into the cable television business to now the full fiber to the premises broadband types of offerings. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, can be applied whether you're just looking at getting into the business, if you're early in the planning stages, or if you're already up and running, because a lot of these principles and a lot of these factors that we'll bring up today are really applicable at any time during the progression of your broadband experience. One of the key things that we do talk about with PSE is that we look at and kind of incorporate in any of our analysis is looking at all the way from the distribution design, operation support, to the complete financial planning pieces of the proposed enterprise. And we want to make sure that we look at it from a holistic approach, and looking at not just the cost and the benefit, the cost and the revenues that you might generate from the business, but what are some of the indirect types of benefits for your utility operations, as well as your community's organization, economic development activities as well. And so things that we're going to really highlight and talk about today is kind of the overview of it, is that we're, especially seeing under this COVID pandemic, that a lot of electric cooperatives, municipal electrics, and the local governments and the county governments are kind of looking and very much intrigued about the idea of jumping in and offering broadband services to their members and constituents. However, what we've seen is a lot of them may be jumping into a decision without really fully understanding what they're getting into and what's the complete set of risk and rewards are, in that process. And when you take a look at it, the going into a broadband business may have some long-term impacts, both positive and potentially negative, of jumping into the broadband business. So we want to make sure that we really look at it completely. And so it really kind of comes down to, you'll hear me talk a lot about, getting into the broadband business might be the best thing, or it might be one of the worst things you've ever done too. So, and I've seen over the years some really good examples and some not so good examples. And a couple of things that we're going to really kind of concentrate on today is going into what are the items that you want to consider when you're doing a feasibility study, and what are some of the key financial and market items that you'd want to consider, and then talk a little bit about what we call these off the balance sheet drivers, like the economic development, load stabilization, and electric utility automation type of efforts that a broadband business might support. So if we take a look at a couple of examples over time, some of the early ones, first one was Norwood Light Department in Norwood, Massachusetts. They got into the business in the early 2000s, and they did what we call the hybrid fiber coaxial approach. And they came in and they offered a triple play service offering cable television, telephone, and broadband services. They've done extremely well over the years. They've been maintaining cash flow, which including full debt service coverage. However, they have seen a little bit of market erosion over the time due to competition. When they first got into the market, they were the first to market with a broadband service. Even though back in 2002, broadband was considered a couple megabits per second, they've grown in capacity as the market demands have done. But they were the first ones with the cable modem service in town. And so they were the first ones that got away from the dial-up service. And so they captured a pretty good market share, but that market share has eroded as Comcast has developed their lineup, and also Verizon came into town and offered a fiber to the premises solution as well. So they've kind of settled in at about a 35% market share. Then on about at the same time, just a little before, Tacoma Power in Tacoma, Washington jumped into the business and again did a hybrid fiber coax deployment. They offered a retail cable television service and did a wholesale broadband service. And they paid cash for the network. They spent about $90 million out of their rate stabilization fund. And so they didn't borrow any money. But however, in their market, they were unable to cover operational expenses and used electric allocations over the years to cover the cash flow shortages. And a couple of years ago, they were court ordered to cease the electric department subsidy. And they subsequently sought a private party to come in and maintain the network for them so they could shed the operational losses. And so here's a couple of examples of one that turned out and met their projections, and the other that kind of ran into a lot of cash flow issues in the process. A couple of other examples here are, one is more recently Huntsville Utilities. And what they did was a little bit different model where they said, we really don't want to get into the broadband business, but we want to do something to help encourage other providers coming to town. And they recognized that their electric utility had a lot of needs and benefits to build out a fiber infrastructure. So they did a fiber infrastructure that passed all the homes and businesses in Huntsville, and then they leased the excess strands under what we call a dark fiber to the premises lease. And Google was the first tenant, and then Google is then coming in, selling the retail service, and then offering the retail service and putting in the drops. So it's one that Huntsville Utilities is just providing the fiber infrastructure, and they had a long-term lease from Google on that. And we're just in the process of entering in a second lease that would be leasing to some of the data centers throughout the city of Huntsville as well. So they're kind of looking at that progression of here's a way that they could facilitate the market without having to become a retail provider themselves. And then the last one here that talk a little bit about is Tipmont Rural Electric Cooperative in Linden, Indiana. And they're really looking at more of a strategic deployment of fiber to the premises. They're getting into the fiber business, in the retail business, but they've also required a CLEC that brought in a lot of expertise and cash flow. And they've partnered with the telephone cooperative to bring in the cable and the telephone service component. And so what we'll talk about today is kind of a process that we've used in Tipmont in kind of planning and rolling out their broadband offering. So we'll talk a lot about these kind of 10 key considerations that they've done over the years. And from that, I'll take a little bit of a break and maybe see if there's any questions that anybody has at this point.
Tom, just maybe a question or thought is, you've described things that happened early on in the process back in the 2000s and the now projects that you're working on actively. Are there some just key market shifts that you've seen over that time? What kind of describes some of those differences?
Yeah, I think one of the key things is, back in 2000, there was a huge focus on cable television, and that seemed to be really the driver. And broadband, in some regards, was a little bit of an afterthought to a lot of offerings. And for example, that was kind of how Tacoma approached theirs, where they really concentrated on the cable television portion of it. And what we've seen, of course, over the past 20 years is a complete shift to where we're seeing most entrants now only thinking about jumping into the broadband play and offering the data services, because the cable television, telephone, and some of those others are really just become services over the internet. And the broadband really has enabled competitive and substitute products to the cable industry and to the telephone industry. So I think that's been one of the biggest changes over the past 20 years.
Perfect. Thank you. That's helpful.
So, and what we're going to talk about is kind of what I call the 10 key considerations when you're looking at planning. And the first thing is one of the things we really have to understand that consumers do have choices. This is a competitive business, and a choice of not acquiring services is actually an alternative. If you're an electric utility and you're going to be looking at jumping into this business, you really want to make sure your operation systems are in order. You really want to make sure your house is in order before you jump into this business, because you're going to jump into this and you're going to ignore your electric operations for a couple of years. You also want to make sure that you do a thorough feasibility study, and you really want to be cautious of advisors that are going to give you no risk deals or offers, and looking at operating your system in the long term. And when you do your study, you really need to know the details. You have to know every assumption and number in your financial analysis and how they're going to work. And another key one is you have to really facilitate learning within your staff. They're the ones that are going to operate this new business on a day-to-day basis, and they really need to understand the business and understand all the assumptions that have gone into it. You also want to tie in and spend some time with your board, and especially want to make sure that they don't go in and try to micromanage the business as you're rolling it out. The other key thing is you really want to make sure that you methodically go through and don't bet the bank on, kind of an all-in-one approach. And I'll talk quite a bit more about this one as we progress in the presentation. And then really taking a look at partnerships and looking at how you can leverage partnerships in your offering. And then also taking a look and studying and learning from others through this process, because there's been some failures and there's been some successes. then you can really learn from that experience. And most importantly, when you look at the spreadsheet, is the spreadsheet, it's just a spreadsheet. And the financial model, and you really have to understand its structure, how the assumptions work, and how well the accounts for changes as you go through the process. And so from that, kind of talk a little bit about the point number one is that, consumers do have some choices. Now, when you look at some of the rural territories, you may look at it and say, hey, I just have a satellite offering, maybe a poor DSL connection. But you also have to remember not acquiring a service is a choice. And today we do see about 5 to 10% of all households not choosing to acquire a broadband product. And in some rural areas and some seasonal accounts, people are not choosing just because they don't want to spend the dollars, for that. And you don't want to miss what is coming around the corner. And we're seeing the expansion of 5G and satellite services out there. So you want to be aware of what changes are going to come, even in some of the rural areas that you may be looking at servicing. The other key thing is you have to be really cautious of a few people that may come to your board meeting or your member meeting, city council meeting. A lot of what you're hearing is from the vocal minority, and it's a vocal minority is really much of a self-selected sample. And so you really want to make sure that you estimate demand based on the holistic by the population of the whole, not just from unsolicited comments from the selected consumers. And the other key thing is, yes, broadband has become an essential service, but it still is not a utility. Utilities are regulated and have a monopoly service area without any competition. And so one of the common mistakes we see is that you'll jump into this, act like a utility without the associated regulations, and you end up with a lot of stranded investment in that. So you really want to be cautious of saying, yes, it's an essential service, but it still is not a utility because it is not a regulated business. Then you also want to make sure that it is a competitive business and it's different than operating a local government or operating your electric utility. And would really stress one of the top 3 things that you have to think about in the broadband business is sales and marketing, sales and marketing, and sales and marketing. And that concept is foreign to a lot of utilities and municipalities across the country. And when you get into customer service, it's a different type of skill set that's needed. And again, you're looking at, it's not a rate setting pricing, it's a market-based pricing that you're looking at. So you're not guaranteed a rate of return, and you have to go out and sell to keep your business afloat. So that's probably one of the most difficult situations from an electric utility and jumping into the broadband business is being able to operate it as a for-choice business. A couple of other things here is when you're looking at the operational preparedness is one of the things is kind of looking at and defining what your mission is. Are you in the electric utility business, or are you really becoming an essential service provider? And so you want to really take a look that you have the policies and everything set in place around that. You'll want to make a key look at your staffing, and you really want to make sure that you have top performers, and you want to have each position pretty well, covered and in place. And one of the other core things is you really want, if you're an electric utility, you really want to make sure that core electric operation is running along. You've caught up, you're ahead of the curve on make ready, tree trimming, all of those core activities. And you really want to make sure that financially and operational, you can take the burden of adding standing up a new business alongside of your electric utility. Then you want to take a look at all your policies. You're going to go into competition with some of the incumbents. You're going to get a lot of attention. You're going to get challenges, and you really need to be prepared for having your policies in place. And you want to have your management and monitoring systems in place before you start building out. And you really want to make sure that you have your cash flow objectives and goals really clearly defined. Because at midterm in the next 8 to 10 years, if you're lucky, this might be a break-even operation in that time frame, and you're going to have to either cover your early losses either through borrowing or using existing funds. So this is really much a long-term investment, and you really have to manage and pay attention to your cash flow as you move along. Then kind of the next third one is you're really wanting to do a thorough study, and you want to be cautious of shortcuts. And one of the key things here, you're about to make a multi-million-dollar decision, and a lot of times we'll see a utility make a decision to move forward based on industry averages and not really doing a design or an estimate that's tailored to their needs. And if you bring in a consultant, you really need to press them pretty hard on saying, how many of their studies did you find the venture not to be feasible? And will they benefit financially if you enter into the broadband business? And if they can't answer any of those, you might want to look for a different consultant, because we see a lot of proposals out there that really sound lucrative, but in fact, what you're doing is they're shifting the risk to your utility or your county, and they're benefiting from the early cash flows, onto that. I think another key thing is you want to make sure that you don't underestimate your staffing needs, and don't overlook operational expenses. And so you really want to, and again, just because you have an electric utility with some of those core functions doesn't mean that you don't have a need to add staff. And the other thing that's really coming more and more prevalent is, the potential for grants, both state and federal grants. And you really want to take a look at those and what grants might be available. From that, I'll take a little bit of a break. Is there any questions that are out there at this point?
Tommy, I think maybe one of the questions that did come up was around availability of grants.
Yeah.
So insight into grant availability?
Yeah, I think we see a lot, we hear a lot about the federal programs, and probably one of the most active ones to date has been the RUS Reconnect program, which has been closed for this year. And they had a series of programs which we expect that they may be looking at again next year, but they have a partial grant and some loans and a combination grant loan type of process. And so that's one to kind of keep an eye on. We should probably be hearing about something towards the end of the year on that. The other one, on the federal one, is the RDOF, or the Rural Development Opportunity Fund, which is more of the reverse auction, where the FCC has identified certain eligible blocks throughout the U.S., which you can apply to get a grant that you'd be paid a sum, per year for the next 10 years. And they'll award that grant to the lowest bidder, the one kind of the entity that would take the least amount of grant to make a commitment to build out broadband to that given area in the next 4 years. That auction is coming up next October. Now, if you already haven't registered, the registration and the application to participate in the RDOF fund closed about 2 weeks ago. So if you hadn't filled out your application, you're not going to be eligible to participate in that auction now. The one grants that I'm probably more intrigued about is on a state-by-state basis. And I think that's where you're going to see some more thorough plays in availability. And for example, in Wisconsin, they're talking about a little over about $20 million that will be made available starting sometime in the late third quarter or the fourth quarter this year. I know Indiana has a similar type of program. Alabama has one. So each one of the states have some pretty robust grant programs. And I think that's where a lot of the activity and focus should be paid attention to.
Perfect, thank you.
Excuse me. So, and again, one of the other key things is making sure, I talked a little bit about that, you want to make sure that you use utility-specific data, and taking a lot of boilerplate national averages or regional averages really can skew the outlook, and especially when you're going into the rural area, because a little bit I'll show you some of the cost, where you can see cost on a per passing basis, of under $1,000, but easily exceed $7,500 depending on the densities and other factors. Then you want to make sure that you do your demand analysis that you're tailored towards your utility. Excuse me, just had something caught my throat there for a second. So you want to really make sure that if you're going to do demand side market, you just don't want to listen to some people that will call you up and say, hey, you have to do something about broadband. You really want to make sure you do a statistically valid outreach and take a look at what the demand really is, and really taking a close look at what competitors are really out there. So you really want to make sure that you just don't base your assumptions based on a couple of samples, but really take a thorough look at what the demand really is in your given service areas. And you can find throughout the territory, and especially in the co-op markets where you have some kind of more urban, suburban type service areas to more rural areas, I've seen take rate projections in kind of more of the suburban type areas down as low as in the 20%, but take rates when you get up in the more rural areas were pushing 70% take rate. So you can see a huge variation even within your service area on what you might expect for take rates. Then another key thing is looking at the cost. You want to make sure that you look at having the full range of cost. A lot of times we'll hear people will ask saying, how much does fiber cost to build? And somebody will say, well, I can build it for $15,000 a mile or $100,000 a mile, or onto that. And you have to really understand, are you talking about using your own crews, or are you using contractor labor? Are you underground or are you overhead? Are you including all the make ready and all the associated cost, or are you just talking about the cost to hang the poles or hang the strand on the poles? And so this is an example out on the East Coast where you take a look at and saying, hey, what is the average cost? And you look at it and say, it was primarily overhead, and the contractor prices were about $37,000 a mile. However, when you look at all the water crossings, railroad crossings that are required, pole analysis, any of the make ready, the documentation, the engineering, that $37,000 a mile was really closer to $54,000 a mile. So it's a huge difference when you start talking about just general cost to taking a look at what the full set of costs that you might see. And that's really critical in taking a look at it. The other is looking at, when you talk about the fiber to the premises, is very highly dependent upon density. And here's some examples across the market where we see down to be under $860 per passing. And a passing is just when you build fiber in front of a house that would enable where you could put a drop and serve that resident. And so kind of more in the suburban, urban type of environments, you can see, under $900 a passing. But when you get up into the more rural areas, it jumps up quickly in $4,000, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 or more. And it's really dependent upon the density that you're looking at. And so under these examples, and this is in the same order, so the high cost to the low cost, if we take a look at the data and I say, what's the cost per mile that was estimated to build in that situation, and what's the densities? And so in that county example where I was saying $7,600 a passing, it was a relatively low cost to build, but it had an extremely low density. And so that's what drove that price up to about $7,500. Whereas on the lower end of the scale, you had a higher cost to build, but the density was quite a bit higher. So you were seeing, they cost not, drop from $7,000 a passing to under $900 a passing. And from that, is there any questions on this?
Just one question, and as you know, if utility is looking at using internal, in-house, resources to do some of the deployment versus contractors, what have you seen around the impact for cost?
Yeah, the impact, of course, on the cost, if you're doing it internally, the cost to build can be considerably less. And I've seen, if you're just buying the fiber and then you're just using your own internal crews to hang the fiber, that cost can be easily be in that $15,000 to $20,000 a mile. But if you have to go out and contract that out with a contractor, you could see that up to, $40,000+ per mile. So it has a huge impact onto it. Now, one of the things they have to be careful of is saying if you're going to be deploying a fiber to the premises system, and you use the in-house labor costs as your core estimate, you really have to take a step back and say, internally, do you have enough crews and do they have enough time that you can actually build that out internally onto it? And in most cases, you're not going to have that, that staff is not going to have that time in order to build, that new network in-house. And the in-house labor would be for kind of more maintenance and special. Here we got a short run or kind of on a case-by-case basis. But I think when you're building out and rolling out the system to begin with, you're really going to have to be looking at contract labor. Otherwise, it's going to take something that you could build and roll out in a couple of years may take you a decade if you try to do it internally. So yes, you can save a lot of money with in-house labor, but you got to look at what is your overall capacity that you have available at that point.
Super, thanks, Tom.
So when I talked a little bit about earlier about surveys and how important it is to make sure that you're looking at a representative sample. And so when you're doing market research, I always say that you want to avoid a couple of these historic survey blunders. And the first one was back in 1936. And that's when Literary Digest predicted Landon would beat out Roosevelt in the election. And of course, we all know that Roosevelt won. But the big mistake on this one is that they used list of phone numbers and country club memberships for their sample selection. And of course, when you look back in 1936, who you're going to be, with phone numbers, who had phones in 1936? It was the upper middle class and very affluent part of the segment of the population. And so what they were doing was they had a self-selected sample that was not representative of the voting population. So they made, that error basically put the Literary Digest out of business. The other one that you probably heard about more is when the Chicago Tribune headlines on Dewey defeating Truman. And of course, we know that didn't happen. But fundamentally, they did kind of the same type of blunder that the Literary Digest did, is they used a telephone poll. And in 1948, again, telephone polls were generally limited to well-to-do households. One of the things that we see today is that we see a lot of people going out and say, I'm going to go out and do a survey, and I'm going to do the survey online. And what you end up doing is you skew your survey results to the ones that are more of the geeks or the ones that are more of the power users over the internet, and you're really not getting a true representative sampling of the population. And so you really want to be careful about avoiding kind of looking, when you're doing market research, making sure you don't get a self-selected sample. The other key thing is when I look at businesses, and when you look at how diverse businesses are in the community. And in this example here, this is Norwich, Connecticut, and they have just under 1,200 businesses in the community. And so you really have a huge variation on the number of employees, the type of business, ownership structures, what type of activities are performed at the location, how much they spend on telecom. And there's some huge differences from how these are made up. And here on this one, looking at just the number of employees, you can see over half the employees in Norwich are actually under 5 employees. And so, and those 614 businesses are going to have a very much different demand and use for broadband than, say, some of the larger businesses. And so when we look at segmentation of business, and one of the ways to look at it is you could take a look at what's their telecom spending, which would include their telephones, cell phones, internet, and data, and take a look at their spending and then compare that to the number of employees. And you can start profiling them to what types of tiers of demand and what type of services that they might be looking for. And so we had quite a bit of information in these couple of graphs here, and seeing if there's any questions on these.
The only, as you look at some of those service levels, what's kind of driving some of the factors driving the service selection in those different tiers? How do they differ?
Yeah, they're going to very much differ. Where you start off in the tier 1, you're really going to be driven not so much on price, but they're going to be more performance. So what type of service level agreements are there? What type of history that you have in that business? And when you're first entering the business as an electric cooperative, a municipal electric, or a municipality, people are going to tend, that's a hard market for you to jump into, because they're really going to be looking at their true cost of doing business on that tier 1 is what happens if they lose that service. And they're going to tend to go to their trusted providers like an AT&T and some of these other providers that have been in the business for years. Whereas if you go on the other side of the scale, this tier 4, they're going to be more driven by cost. And something like that, a low-end DSL service is probably going to serve them quite well. And they're going to be more apt to look at, they're going to, something that's, better than dial-up, but not quite as good as a cable modem, generally serves them quite well. Whereas if you're looking at, like a broadband offering, your probably biggest opportunity is more in that tier 3 marketplace, where you want something that's more robust than DSL, and maybe something a little bit more robust than some of the cable modems if you're doing fiber. And so that tends to be more of the market that would probably be aligned more to a electric cooperative or a municipal electric offering.
Perfect, thanks, Tim. That's helpful.
Yep. So then again, kind of looking at it, the other key things here is making sure that you understand the feasibility study is different from the business plan, where the feasibility study really gives you that sense of the risk and opportunity, whereas the business plan really gives you more of that direction, execution, and strategy. One of the things we're also, when you're looking at it, is you really have to understand that your competition really has a lot better of economies and scale that you do have. And one of the common mistakes I've made over the years is that you try to jump into it and initiate a price war. And if you initiate a price war, you're going to lose, because they have scale that you can't even come close to. So you really have to find a niche and find a nice theme. And kind of that example in Norwood, Massachusetts, they were able to really kind of hone in on a theme, on kind of a slogan of saying, keep your money on Main Street, not on Wall Street. And they really kind of, they were had a little bit higher price service than the competition, but they really stressed, hey, you're dealing with the local firm, the local sense, and kind of playing to that sense of market. And that's where they've been able to kind of hang on to their market share on fitting that. So they didn't try to be all things to everybody, but found their niche to serve the community. So another key thing is when you're going through this, you want to know and understand every assumption, and you want to know the basis for every assumption in the model, and you want to make sure that you have a working copy of the financial projection model. And you want to challenge, and when you're going through and have the consultant come in, you want to challenge every assumption that they lay out, and understand how every assumption's used and how that assumption impacts the results of the model. Because it's very easy to change 2 or 3 variables, and you can make something look good, that might be a bad situation, or even on the reverse, you can make a bad situation, a good situation look real bad as well. So you really want to go in and understand all the details on every assumption that go into it. And when you go into the cost allocations, and especially with electric utilities, there's a lot of discussion around, what are the benefits for having fiber to the premises and broadband available to the electric utility for the electric operations. And so when you look at the potential cost allocations to it, you really want to make sure you understand what are the allocations are being made. Are those allocations reasonable? Can you defend them? Could you defend them in a court action? Can your electric utility afford those allocations? And are those actions legal? And so you really want to, any cost allocations, you really want to understand the basis for that allocation, and you want to be able to defend any of the allocations made. And another key thing on these models is, the model itself doesn't correct or modify any type of an assumptions made. It's the assumptions that really drive the projections. And so, when looking at kind of some of the impacts of allocations, here's a forecast of a study that we're just working on right now. And the utility has it set up as, this is how we're showing the cash flow in and out coming from the proposed broadband business. And in this example, it looks like we're kind of seeing a payback crossover at about year 8. And that's where the outflows, cumulative outflows, become lower than the cumulative inflows. But what's deceiving a little bit on this projection is this one does not have what they're allocating to the electric utility. So if I turn around, then the first thing, the electric utility is covering the cost of the outside fiber plant in this model. And so that's the jump, the blue line, the outflows on the unallocated model. If I was going to allocate those to not allocate those to the electric business, the outflows in this model would be that top yellow line. And so by the year 20, you're still showing about a $10 million gap between the outflows and the inflows. Then in addition to this, is that, there are also some, other types of expense that are allocated, which would shift that up a little bit higher. So I think one of the key things is when you're looking at it, in this case, the electric utility is outlined some core reasons why they feel that this fiber plant is necessary for the electric operations. And they've really rolled these costs into their electric forecast, and they're making sure that it's not causing a rate increase or, putting their electric business at risk. And from that, is there any questions on this graph here?
Sorry about that. No, Tom, I think we're good.
Okay. The next one is, the team learning. Your staff this is a new business, and your staff is the one that's going to operate this business on a day-to-day basis. And so you need to make sure that your staff is going to own every assumption that's used in the model. And you gotta give your team, when you're going through this planning stage, you got to give your team and your senior staff time to participate, time to feed into it and buy into the new business structure, because they're the ones, in the end of the day, they're the ones that are going to make this new enterprise work or not work. Then at the same time, you want to make sure that you invest time with your board. And the board, of course, is going to make, the ultimate decisions. But you want to make sure that the board doesn't, especially when you're getting into like on a co-op or a municipal electric, where you don't want your board to have your consumers outreach to the board and start saying, hey, I know that you're serving this part of the service area. I really need broadband in my territory. What can you do to accelerate that build out? That can really turn chaos into your deployment plans if you're letting the board drive your day-to-day decisions onto it. So you really want to make sure that they're involved and making sure that they understand some of your reasons, and so they don't jump in trying to micromanage yourself as well. So you got to spend that time with your board to make sure that they understand that this is a new business themselves. Then another key thing is you really want to roll this out methodically and really kind of consider some stages, especially if you're a municipal, cooperative. I mean, a cooperative electric or serving a county area. And so you may be wanting to look at saying, I'm going to go after where a market area that's going to be, there's demand and you have some limited choices, but a reasonable build cost. And that one, you can go out, you can get a fairly good market share in those areas. You build out some cash, you get some revenue coming in, and then you can go in and start building out more of the higher cost areas. And then maybe at some point in time, then you start building into areas that have a higher competitive majors. So, and one of the common mistakes is that we see is that you go out and just try to scramble and build out to everybody and pass every consumer that you have in your service area as quickly as possible. But in that approach, what you end up doing is you end up with a lot of stranded investment and a number of years before that investment starts generating cash. So I think you want to you phase, you build, sell, work to positive cash flow, then build again. So that methodically it keeps your exposure and your growth a lot more controlled on that. Then the other thing is that you may, when you look at it, and you may be around your staff and you may be not enamored with broadband, but there's a lot of consumers that are going to be happy with 10 megabits or less on the data connection. Especially when you get into the municipal marketplaces, many households just use the smartphone for their data connection. And today, over 20% nationwide today of households use the cell phone as their only data connection at all. And, you do have a number of households that are not going to acquire any service. So you have to be really understand what that demand is as you're building out this network. Another key is you're looking at partnerships, and partnerships can be a key way to avoid risks and reduce capital costs. But one of the things you want to really be sure of is you want to make sure that you're not jumping into something that is truly a one-sided offer. A lot of the partnerships with quotes on them that I've seen over the years have been pretty one-sided offers where the municipality or electric cooperative is really taking the core risk and the partner is taking a lot of the rewards. But I think partnerships are very much a key part of this, that they can bring you some scale and expertise, but you really want to make sure that you're getting a good a deal on any partnership that you're considering. And from that, take a break on, is there any questions at this point?
Yeah, just one quick question, really on partnerships. Can you expand on that a little bit more and what that might mean for broadband and what those might be like?
Yeah, I think a partnership is maybe an overused word. It's a lot of times they're more strategic alliances where you look at and saying, hey, you have one party, for example, like in Tipmont, where we're working with them, they've partnered with what we call Mulberry Telephone Company. And in that case, what Mulberry is they're bringing in, they have the cable TV content and they have the telephone content. And what Tipmont is able to do is they, in essence, will offer a transport service to Mulberry. And they get paid X number of dollars per month for transporting a cable and a telephone product. And Mulberry goes and actually does the selling of that and collects the money for the cable and the telephone revenue. And so they just get the transport piece of it. So a partnership, technically, legally, a partnership is where there's a contract entered, both it's a fairly legal document. These partnerships are more, probably would be a better word, more of an alliance, and usually driven by a contract that you're going to do X, Y, and Z, and in return, you're going to get this service or this payment for it. I don't know if that answered the question there, Jim.
Yeah, I think it did. I think it did.
Yep.
And there was a couple of other questions that came in that might be related. So let me pose them both to you. The first is, with the 20% smartphone usage, where is that seen? Is it mostly rural or in cities? And I think maybe in parallel with that is rural users might not have a choice or a lot of choices. So maybe you can kind of address those two in parallel.
Yeah. Yeah, great. On the 20%, that's primarily, there's two segments, and that's going to be driven largely in some of the more urban areas today, because that's where the smartphone coverage is better. And that 20% is generally segmented into two groups. One is the low income population, where they're looking at it and they just can't afford to have both a smartphone and a data connection at home. So they've chosen the smartphone because they can also do data on it. The other set is kind of the 20 to 30-year-old crowd. And so the households that are under 30 households in age. And they're tending, in those younger households, are tending to be more smartphone based than fixed based. And that's where the big growth factor has occurred over the years onto that. Now we are seeing in kind of in the discussion, the follow-up question on the rural users, what we are seeing are the interest in some of the cell carriers on they're slowly extending coverage more out in the rural areas. And it may not have some good coverage today, but it's one that is evolving. And we have providers such as T-Mobile that have made a effort on providing and going after the fixed market. And where T-Mobile is looking at offering a $50 a month household service with no data caps. And that's something that they've been offering for a couple of years. And they've been expanding that in certain parts of the country a lot more aggressively. So it's something that you want to take a look on your case-by-case basis. One of the things that's often misunderstood with 5G, a lot of people will look at the 5G coverage as being just the millimeter, the real high frequency, the frequencies that are used that would only go a few, 1,000 foot or a few hundred feet in coverage areas. A 5G actually has a mid-band in the 4 gigahertz and actually a low band in the 700 megahertz frequencies as well. And that's something that both T-Mobile and Sprint were very aggressive in acquiring spectrum in that band. And those bands in the rural areas are a lot more usable to deliver rural service coverages. So it's one that I think you're going to see more and more coverages expand out from some of those carriers. And again, you really have to take a close look on a case-by-case basis.
Super, thank you, Tom. That's really good. And so, that's great. There's one other question that came in, and I'll let you pose that as you kind of, obviously we have 6 minutes left, so we want to honor the time of everyone, but maybe as you're talking, just how are utilities using broadband beyond kind of other services for their own use, their own communications for their own systems, AMI and others. So, but I'll let you do that as you go on.
Yeah, and I think some of the key things on electric utility use, of course, when you look at, the substation connections are kind of the first layer, and where you're starting to get more than just the SCADA communications from the substation, but looking at trying to bring video and other types of high data traffic. And so that's really kind of one of the first areas of saying what portion of your broadband network can be used for the substation communication. Then you extending out from that, you can be looking at communications to reclosers, motor operated switches, and some of those more critical field area network devices that the utility might operate. And then you start taking a look in for like the AMI concentrators, from the backhaul, from the gateways, items like that. And then taking a look at what role is broadband going to play with distributed energy resources, and such there as well. And so, so you want to take a look at kind of how this layered approach might evolve for supporting the electric utility operations. So from that, you'd want to kind of looking at, we talked a little bit about what are some of the common mistakes that we've seen over the years. And a couple of them are, underestimation of the build cost, overlooking make-ready cost, overestimation of the take rates, ignoring the sales and marketing costs, and really understanding the what it takes for the staffing for customer service and customer service reps. And you're trying to be too many things to everybody, at the same time. The other key thing is fiber. Fiber may be a good 20 to 30 year investment, but some of your electronics are going to have to be replaced every 5 to 10 years. And so you want to make sure you have your model of showing those replenishments and the replacements, and also the vendor maintenance contracts. The other thing is unlike, you have more bad debt in this broadband business than you do in the electric business. And then another common one is you have an inflation factor, and you have to be, when you're looking at these long-term investments, you really have to be careful on how do you treat inflation. And a lot of times we'll see models where you'll take and say, hey, we have to account for inflation, so they'll put a 3% on revenues and a 3% on expenses. And if you do that, you end up compounding your net margins, which is really not realistic. And so, in this example, on the top graph in the top circles is kind of showing a condensed income statement and a cash flow statement. And then where you can see the cash flow balance, where you see in year 5, we've got about 6.2 million and goes up to about 13 million in year 10 and just under 41 million in year 20. And that one uses an inflation factor on the same percentage on expenses and the same percentages on revenues. But if I looked at it and I said, hey, I'll add inflation, but I want to make sure that, one of the things that I'm just maintaining contribution margins, and which would be what's your revenues less expenses. And if I just maintain those at an even pace, what does this model look like? And all of a sudden, we look at in the first 5 years, we're seeing a $5 million balance rather than the 6.2, so they're pretty close. But by the year 20, we're seeing a difference of almost $38 million difference between the two models. And the only change in these two models is just how inflation was treated. And so when we're dealing with these long-term investments, you really have to be careful with some of these inflation factors, because you can make a model that's really kind of marginal, you can make look really fantastic. And in this industry, in the broadband industry, over the past, what we've been seeing is your net revenues per subscriber have been on a decline while your service levels have gone up. And so the providers, when you get into the broadband business, you're really going to having to manage your business by managing costs while you're seeing kind of decreasing revenues coming from your subscriber base. And so it's not one that you're going to see this huge growth every year on revenue growth through inflation. And so there's any questions on that?
That's really good. A question came in that was separate from that. And again, too, I hope everyone is doing well. So we are at 3 o'clock. We have just a few slides, so we'll work on finishing those up and answering questions. And if anyone isn't able to stick with us the whole time, we will be sharing the presentation. So, but anyhow, Tom, the question came on, on 5G. Can you help understand? Certainly, sometimes 5G is talked about as really fast speeds, but any idea of kind of what the minimum up-down speeds are in 5G? Certainly, each one of the cellular technologies scales down to different speeds, and so while 4G might have megabits or hundreds of megabits, it can come down to tens of megabits. Is 5G similar, and any idea what those minimums might be?
Well, that's going to vary. That's a great question, and that's going to vary a bit carrier by carrier and exactly what frequency they're using, in that deployment situation. Most of what I've seen the carriers talk about in more of the 5G in the rural areas is in that service that's going to be in that 100 meg, down level and 20 plus meg up. And for, one from an experience level, when I first, when the COVID, when the first lockdown was going, I was at my apartment out in Delaware, and which didn't have internet access. So I was having to use my AT&T service. And in that situation, I was getting about 120, 140 meg down and 50 meg up service on that. And that was just on the 4G connection. But of course, I think on that you have to watch your data ceiling limits. And so, but when I look at the T-Mobile and even with their 5G, they're talking more about in that 100 meg service level, even though that they could pick it up higher. I think the 1 gig type services on 5G are going to be more in the urban type areas with the higher frequency bands.
Perfect, thank you. I think that's good. And to everyone too, great questions coming in. If we're not getting to, in the brevity of time, we're not answering them well, feel free to follow up with us. We're happy to elaborate.
Yep. And so from that one, kind of one of the last points here is, we've talked a lot about this, about the inflation factor. And with the spreadsheet, your spreadsheet is only, your projections are only as good as your assumptions. It's just, so the analysis is more than just a spreadsheet on that. And you really want to make sure when you look at an outputs, you really want to make sure that you're looking for a year-by-year income statement, cash flow statement, a balance sheet, and capital addition summary. A lot of analysis will just say, hey, look at this model. We show an internal rate of return of 3%, so it's great. However, what you might have is a model that for the first 15 years, you got a negative cash flow, and then the last 10 years, or 5 to 10 years, you're recovering from that. And you want to really clearly understand any of the allocations and just really understand that this, in the end, the spreadsheet is not correcting, any of the models. And so kind of really in summary, you really want to make sure that you take a methodical approach, understand this is a 4-choice balance, a 4-choice business, and that you really want to make sure your staff, management, and board are in ready. And if you bring in somebody to do a feasibility study, make sure that they're performing independently and don't have any gains and financial benefits by you moving forward. And you want to just avoid a lot of the common mistakes and really look at and understand it's not, you have to really look at your mission and community drivers, onto that. And from that, kind of just a quick update of the Tipmont status is one of the things that their planning went about 4 years before they jumped into the business. And they started by really taking a look and saying, reshaping their mission and purpose of the co-op, and then structuring the policies all around that. Then they also take a look and they really approach this methodically. And like I talked about, they went out and did a CLEC acquisition, partnered with the telephone cooperative, and really did a phased deployment approach. And they look for ways to leverage the fiber wherever possible for the electric operations. And so they really take this methodical approach that really followed a lot of the things that I talked about here throughout the presentation. And again, all of these things are, no matter where you are in the process and in this progression of your planning, you can look at applying any of these type of principles onto this. And so now, given that, I just want to kind of go through any last questions that might be here.
Thank you, Tom. We'll let everyone give a second just to send in any others, but we had a lot of good questions, and I think at least we've touched on each one, and happy to expand if others have more. So. Okay, yeah, not seeing any more coming in at least now. So I'll let you say thank you to everyone, and we appreciate the time.
Okay, and appreciate it. And if there's any follow-up questions like that, just feel free to give either Jim or I a call or send us an email, and we'll be happy to follow up with you on any of the things. And then here later this afternoon, I'll be sending out a PDF of the presentation as well. And from that, appreciate everybody's time and attention today, and look forward to talking to you in the future here.